briefing session hosted by the United Nations Environment Programme on the resolution on mineral resource governance. This resolution was adopted in 2019 during the fourth session of the United Nations Environment Assembly. Thank you very much for having made the time for this consultation today. On behalf of the Executive Director, Madam Inga, and also the Regional Director for Africa, Madam Juliet, I would like to extend our warm welcome to all of you. My name is Cecilia Jenga. I am the head of the South Africa office of UNEP, based in Pretoria, South Africa. I will be facilitating the session today. UNEP is convening a series of virtual consultations at multiple scales, sub-regional, regional, and global. The consultations are being convened in all UNEP's regions from July to September 2020, this year. There will also be a global forum later in 2020 where all the regions will be brought together to be updated on the next steps. As we prepare for the fifth session of the Environment Assembly, which will be held in February 2021. During today's consultations, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we will provide a briefing and an update to the member states on the consultation process and the implementation of the resolution. We will also be seeking your feedback on a number of questions related to the governance of mineral resources in your respective jurisdictions in order to help us better report back on the fifth United Nations Environment Assembly. The consultation has been organized jointly by the United Nations Environment Programme and our technical partners, the University of Queensland Sustainable Minerals Institute in Australia. We are also grateful to the generous support of the Government of Switzerland's Federal Office of the Environment to implement this resolution, and the Government of Mexico, who has very kindly sponsored this resolution during UNEA4. Throughout this consultation, we will use the terms Environment Assembly, UNEA4, or UNEA to refer to UNEP's decision-making body on the environment. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we are hosting this virtual consultation during this extraordinary time when countries across the globe and in our region are fighting a deadly pandemic. We acknowledge that the COVID-19 pandemic is a global health crisis, which is resulting in significant and far-reaching socio-economic impacts. At UNEP, we remain deeply committed to our core mandate of facilitating global environmental governance by adopting virtual channels such as this to hold discussions. This is because at the end of the day, the health of the people and the health of our planet are intimately connected. UNEP is committed to working with governments to sustainably recover and build back better and build more resilient economies to future crises. The implementation of this resolution on sustainable mineral governance can greatly contribute to the recovery process for Africa. I would like to acknowledge a few key persons involved in the implementation of this resolution. Firstly, as I mentioned, the government of Switzerland and Mexico, which is hereby represented by Ms. Laura Plachkov and Ms. Gabriela Milan, respectively. Within UNEP, I would also like to acknowledge our Regional Director, Madame Juliet Biao, Mr. Robert Wabunoha, the Regional Coordinator for Environmental Governance for Africa, Mr. Patrick Mwesigie, Regional Coordinator for Resource Efficiency and Sustainable Consumption and Production, Ms. Lygia Noronna, Director of UNEP's Economy Division, Elisa Tonda, Head of the Consumption and Production Unit in UNEP's Economy Division, and Angela Karaoke, our Program Officer in the UNEP's Law Division. I'm also very pleased to introduce our technical partners, Professor Daniel Frank, who is the program leader of governance and leadership in mining at the Sustainable Minerals Institute in the University of Queensland, and Julia Keenan, a research fellow at the Centre for Responsibility and Mining in University of Queensland. As the government sponsor of this resolution have highlighted, the adoption of the resolution was an important step for UNEP because mineral resource governance lies at the heart of sustainable development. Indeed, the extraction, but also the use of mineral resources can pose a fundamental threat to the environment. Important economic interests are involved, and typically the poorest and socially most disadvantaged are the ones that suffer most from unsound extraction of mineral resources. Therefore, it's important that the international community starts to address this challenge. At UNEP, we recognize that international cooperation is indeed necessary to solve governance issues in the extractive industries. Through the UNEA4 resolution, UNEP was requested to collect best practices, information about the challenges and the difficulties, and also to make an assessment about possible ways of how to best govern mineral resources and extraction. This work is important, and it will lead towards a report that can provide the basis for the next step at UNEA in 2021. So what we'd like to hear from you all today are your insights, your expertise, and your knowledge about difficulties, about challenges, but also about best practices and success stories, so that UNEP can collect that information and be prepared for submission to UNEA in 2021. We also believe it will be a useful exercise so that governments of the world can then come together next year and decide on the next steps to make sure that the minerals we'll use in future will be used in a sustainable manner. Before I give the floor to our first speaker, allow me to provide you with an overview of the consultation. First, we will hear from 3 experts who are also involved in the development of key foundational studies that have contributed to the development of the discussion paper that you will have received by email. I hope you've all received the paper. These experts will highlight key issues around science and sustainability, around mine tailings and mineral resource governance in the 21st century. We will then turn to Professor Daniel Frank, who will present a more detailed briefing on the resolution. This presentation will cover details of the resolution and specifically the operative paragraph that we are implementing. He will also take us through the upcoming consultation processes, describing the events, the structure, and feedback options that will form the process for getting us to the global forum and ultimately to UNEA5. A Q&A session will follow next, and the chat function of this platform is available to receive your questions throughout the consultation. Please state your questions concisely and clearly. We will try to address as many questions as possible. We will then move on to a discussion portion of this meeting where we will be seeking your feedback on 3 pertinent questions that will be shared at that time on the screen. Please note that this consultation is being recorded. So, with this introduction, I would like to invite Pascal Pedozzi, GRIEF Geneva, to present on the sand and sustainability study. Welcome, and let's play the video. Yeah, there is no sound. If we can get the sound on the video, please.
Yeah, Musa saw it. He said, noted with thanks. Yeah, I told him further to my previous. The meeting will start at 8 a.m. Gambian time. Nairobi is 3 hours. It's like noted with thanks. He responded at 11 yesterday.
Yes, kindly mute. Kindly mute.
Is it the network? Seems like they're speaking.
Hello? No sound on the...
Buildings, dams. We even use that for glasses, be it for windows or for glasses. We are using that for computer chips. Hello, my name is Pascal Peduzzi. I'm the director of CRISPR, which is a center for analytics for the United Nations Environment Program. Today we're going to talk about sand. When we think about sand, we are usually thinking about beautiful beaches. That's what we think we're doing with sand most of the time. But in fact, our relationship with sand is more like this. We're mixing that with water, cement, and gravels, and we are making concrete. With concrete, we are building roads, buildings, dams. We even use that for glasses, be it for windows or for glasses. We are using that for computer chips. In fact, our entire development societies are built on sand. But sand is produced very slowly at a geological scale. For example, all the rivers and glaciers of the world, every year they're shifting about 24 billion tons of this material. But we humans are using it twice as much. How do we know how much we're using of this material? It's very difficult because, in fact, there is no global monitoring. But what we know is the amount of cement that we're using. We're using 4.1 billion tons of cement per year, and this has been recorded. And the vast majority of that is being used in China. The relationship with cement and sand is quite one-to-one. It's not that we This is not the recipe for making concrete, but we use sand for many other things than just making concrete. So if you look at this graph from the use of sand versus cement in the United States, we see that there is a nearly one correlation of sand that's used with cement. And in fact, it's about 10 to 1. So for every single tons of cement, we're using 10 tons of sand, meaning that if we extrapolate that on top of land reclamation that we're using, for example, it's not only for building purpose, but we also use that for making artificial islands. For example, in Dubai, this is an image in 2001, and this is the same place in 2011. One of these artificial island structures used 1.2 billion tons of sand. Singapore is also using a vast amount of sand for increasing its territory. Since 1973, they increased the territory by 23.2% using sand from Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Cambodia, and then as far as Myanmar and Vietnam. So if we look at this amount of sand, we come to something like 50 billion tons of sand per year. Now, this amount is really big. So it is enough for building a wall of 27 meters high by 27 meters wide all around planet Earth every single year. So where is it coming from? We can take it from quarries on the land. So this has an impact because we need to clear the vegetation, then we dig a hole. It has an adverse impact on the landscape. But actually, in this location, when it's done on quarries, sand is not a dynamic part of the ecosystem. It's like a deposit. So it doesn't harm that much the environment as it looks, as bad as it looks. We can actually fill the gap afterwards with inert waste, and then put some earth on top of that and replant vegetation. We use that as agricultural land. However, this is something that will be a development over 50, 60 years. Now, there are other places where we're taking sand is a bit more problematic. For example, this is me in Tunisia. People have been taking sand land more susceptible to be infiltrated by salty water that can affect the aquifer. People are also taking sand from rivers, and when you do that, you're actually making the rivers, the shape of the river, deeper, and you may have impact on the erosion of the river banks, and it can lead to further flood downstream or drought upstream. And there's several other impacts on fauna and flora because you're changing the turbidity and changing the ecosystem. You can take it from the beaches. Again, this is where sand is playing a dynamic part of it, like in rivers. Sand on the beaches are actually protecting our shoreline against storm surge, against sea level rise, and against the infiltration of salty water. It also preempts any touristic development in the future if you remove all this sand from the beach. And obviously, it's destroying the habitat of this beach where turtles are nesting and birds are feeding themselves. Imagine this beach after just one day of operation, it's gone. And then they go to the next beach and extending the process and impact further. Sand is also taking from the marine environment. These giant boats, it looks like a huge vacuum cleaner. And that's what actually they do. They are vacuum cleaning the bottom of the sea by taking all the sand, crunching all the microorganisms that are living there. And those microorganisms are the ones that are feeding the fishes that are then feeding fishes and so on. And when this boat is taking the sand, they are rejecting particles that are too fine, creating this plume that we see, changing the turbidity of the water. This operation at the bottom and the release of this plume has impact on biodiversity and on fishery. But also when you're removing sand offshore, you're creating a gap. And that gap will be filled by sand that can behave a bit like a liquid by gently flowing in the direction of this gap to slowly fill this gap, creating beach erosion. And this is happening in many different places, not only because of the fact that we're taking sand away, but also because of sea level rise and intensification of waves and other destruction of the coastal ecosystem. But by taking sand away, we are accelerating this process. So why don't we use the sand from the deserts? Well, the wind erosion produces sand that is very round and very fine, and it does not apply as the same as the sand that you can get from glacier or wave erosion. It doesn't stick very well. It's not edgy enough, so not very fit for construction, and even less so for land reclamation. Also, it takes deserts are by definition not places that are inhabited. So if you need to transport the sand from the desert to where you need it, it will be extremely costly. So the trend is of use of sand is accelerated by the fact that we are living in the urban and urbanization. So people are now moving from villages into the cities, requesting infrastructures for housing, for infrastructures for school, for healthcare, for airport, from dikes and bridges and so on. So those infrastructures are heavily depending on the building material, obviously. And also we have a population dynamic. The world population will stabilize between 9.5 or 11 billion in 2050. Well, by then, African population will double. And by doubling, we mean another 1.27 billion people on top of the existing African population. So this associated with migration from rural to urban area, and as well as catching back on the infrastructures that they need for their development, means that there is a huge pressure on sand and building material. So, time for panicking. Now it's time to look at solutions. And that's what we ask experts about what we can do in terms of reducing our footprint on sand resources and how we can reduce the impact on the environment. So basically, we have to rethink our consumption model. That's not only for sand, it's valid for all the type of resources that we're using. But basically, we can reduce our demand for sand by making sure that the projects are well thought and it's really something that we need. We can also reuse building or retrofit them instead of knocking them down. Now, if we need to destroy them and rebuild, then we can recycle the concrete, and part of that material can be then reused for rebuilding. And we can also retrieve material in our dam site, and in fact in our waste, we can use the bottom ash from the waste to make a substitute for sand. We can also improve the way we're extracting sand by making an environmental impact assessment prior to extract the sand, and making sure that we have then the environment, making it as clean as it is, or even better after the operation. So preserving the biodiversity and making it in a nice way. So what are the next steps? Well, we circulated this report through all the member states, and they recognized the finding of our report, and they adopted the resolutions for sustainable sand management. And now this is what we're going to do, is to collect information on sustainable practices, identify the knowledge gap, present existing solutions and best practices. And this is the way that we will inform our member states about how to better improve their relationship with sand and making it more sustainable.
Thank you very much, Pascal Peduzzi, the director of GREED Arendelle, GREED Geneva, not GREED Arendelle. Thank you very much for that. I think the video has raised some important questions. We are in Africa, where we are experiencing an increased rate of urbanization, an enormous leap in the construction industry. And indeed, the video has been able to expose us to some of the impacts of sand extraction, excessive sand extraction on our ecosystem, flora and fauna, both on land and on sea, and the need for us to rethink our consumption model and move towards and transition towards sustainable construction and sustainable building, as well as rethink the extractive approach towards a much more sustainable approach that preserves and safeguards our environment. Thank you very much, Pascal. I'm now pleased to give the floor to Elaine Baker, who will share with us a few words on mine tailings. Very welcome, Baker. Elaine Baker, can you hear me?
Hello, my name is Elaine Baker. I'm a geoscientist at the University of Sydney, and I work with Grid Arundel, an official collaborating centre of the United Nations Environment Programme. We've been working with UNEP for the last 4 years, looking at the way the world deals with mine waste. Mining is essential for sustainable development, but the benefits of mining shouldn't come at the expense of lives, livelihoods, and the environment, which unfortunately is currently the case in many places around the world. It was very depressing to hear on the news last week that more than 170 people had been killed at a jade mine in Myanmar. It appears that heavy rain caused unconsolidated sediment that had been deposited on a slope to fail, resulting in a massive landslide. The people working at the base of the slope were unable to escape the river of mud and were swept away. These workers look for small pieces of jade that are left in the waste pile after the industrial mining has been through. Officially, jade mining in Myanmar is worth $1 billion or so a year, but some experts put the real figure at closer to $40 billion a year. It was another fatal mine waste accident in 2015 that prompted a number of NGOs to ask the United Nations Environment Programme to examine the management of mine waste. Together with international experts, we produced this rapid response assessment report titled Mine Tailings Storage, Safety or Accident. The report documents the enormous human and environmental cost of tailings dams disasters and examines opportunities to improve safety and encourage innovation in dealing with mine waste. So what are mine tailings and how are they stored? Tailings are the waste left over after the economical fraction has been removed. Typically, they're stored behind large embankments that can reach hundreds of metres in height and are built progressively over the life of the mine, which may be many, many years. They're made out of the mine's waste rock and sediment. The most common methods of embankment construction are illustrated on this slide and are described as upstream, downstream and centerline. This refers to the direction in which the embankment crest moves in relation to the base. Embankments can be built using one of these methods or a combination. The upstream method generally has the lowest initial cost and has historically been the most popular method for dam construction in areas with low seismic activity. You can see from this slide that the embankment rests on this lighter-coloured material, which is actually the tailings. The number of dam failures associated with upstream dams has led to increased scrutiny of this method. Modern tailings dams can be huge. This is the Fort Knox gold mine in Alaska. It's a cross-valley dam constructed using the downstream method. At the end of the life of the mine, the facility is expected to cover almost 400 hectares and contain nearly 300 million tonnes of mine waste. The volume of tailings produced per tonne of ore is increasing because of declining ore grades. Basically, we've mined the most accessible high-grade ores. The total volume of tailings on the planet is currently unknown, as is the number of tailings dams. But the most recent calculations suggest that around 9 billion tonnes of tailings are produced each year. To put that in perspective, that's around 2.7 million Olympic swimming pools. When tailings dams fail, the consequences can be extreme. That prompted the rapid response report occurred at Samarco mine in Brazil in 2015. 19 people were killed, and the 33 million cubic metres of tailings that were released caused huge environmental and social damage. The red-stained mud from the iron ore mine destroyed houses, farmland, and damaged an extensive river system. This included 4 water dams that supplied drinking water to hundreds of thousands of people. The plume went all the way to the Atlantic coast, more than 640 kilometres. So what's in tailings? Well, it depends on the ore type and the processing methods. Tailings can range from relatively non-toxic sediments to highly toxic mixtures with high concentrations of heavy metal, radioactive substances and processing chemicals. This bar graph shows an estimate of the amount of valuable metals contained in tailings released when a tailings dam collapsed in Spain in the late 1990s. Thousands of tonnes of valuable material. Processing efficiency has improved since then, so there may be lower concentrations of target metals in mine waste today. But at many mines, valuable non-target commodities are not extracted during processing and therefore remain in the waste. Because tailings are a source of metals, some are being remined, and there are plans to make this part of the broader rehabilitation process at abandoned and closed mines. However, unfortunately, there is currently little application and no market for most mine tailings. There are alternatives to storing wet tailings in dams. Tailings can be filtered to remove water and produce a stackable material. The method has the advantage of eliminating catastrophic dam failures and conserving water. There are some downsides, which include high costs and the potential for erosion or seepage from the stacked material. After looking at the governance and management of mine tailings and examining case studies of past failures, the authors of the Rapid Response Assessment made some recommendations. These included improving the management of tailings through implementation of best practice standards, increased transparency of operation, and the introduction of mechanisms to improve accountability. The report also called for the development of financial assurance for proper mine closure and the establishment of an insurance pool to protect people and the environment in the event of a catastrophic failure. Some of these initiatives already existed in operational standards, but due to lack of reporting and transparency, it's been difficult to assess the quality of the implementation of these standards. And of course, tailings dams continue to fail. It's hoped that the recently completed Global Industry Standard on Tailings Management will address this and will also provide incentive for the industry to reach the goal of zero tailings facility failures.
Thank you very much, Elaine Baker from Greed Arundel, on a few words on mine tailings. Let us now turn to hear some remarks from Antonio Pedro of the International Resource Panel. Antonio Pedro, please come on.
As we have indicated in our IRP report, mineral resources governance in the 21st century, there's a growing recognition that if well managed, the extractive sector can play a positive role in promoting broad-based development and structural transformation of many resource-rich countries. This includes an important contribution to the implementation of all the SDGs. Nevertheless, poor management and bad governance can lead to resource-driven conflicts, security of supply crisis, violation of human rights, severe environmental impacts, social disruptions, economic instability, poverty, rent capture and tax evasion, which will contribute to reversing any potential development gains. It has long, therefore, been recognized that governance is key for mitigating these adverse impacts and enhancing the positive economic, social, and environmental outcomes of mining. There is already a plethora of domestic, regional, international, legal, and regulatory frameworks, initiatives, and instruments, including at company level, all aimed at better governing the extractive industry for increased economic prosperity and environmental protection. The IRP report on mineral resource governance mapped and evaluated almost 90 international initiatives pertaining to the extractive sector. It identified many commendable initiatives such as the African Mining Vision, the ITI, the Global Reporting Initiative, the Natural Resources Charter, and the wider work of the International Council on Mining and Metals, to name a few. However, on all, our report concludes that most of the existing policy frameworks and instruments governing the mining sector represent piecemeal efforts and, importantly, often fail to be implemented at the national level. a transition away from the enclave nature of extractive industry prevalent in the developing world, and ensure the implementation of these SDGs requires, therefore, a new holistic global governance framework. Our IRP report refers to this as Sustained Development License to Operate, or SDLO. The SDLO recognizes planetary boundaries, promotes the circular economy, embraces life cycle and landscape approaches, measures success on the basis of a quadruple bottom line approach, covers the entire mineral value chain, and facilitates shared value creation and a fair distribution of benefits. Such a multi-level, holistic, and integrated framework is applicable to governments, companies, shareholders, institutional investors, labor, local communities and indigenous people, civil society, consumers, and a broader range of other stakeholders in the extractive industry. The SDLO framework seeks to create a more coherent governance landscape by advocating for cross-stakeholder coordination of goals, upward harmonization of global standards and metrics, concerted consolidation of excellence, as well as by pointing to areas where new instruments might be needed and how a particular instrument will interact with others through greater interoperability. At the international level, the IRP report also discusses the creation of an international minerals agency or the signing of an international agreement to inter-area coordinate and share data on economic geology, mineral demand needs, and promote transparency on impacts and benefits. In line with the SDLO, our other recommendations for practical near-term actions to improve global mineral governance include the following: a global platform for continued dialogue and advocacy on cross-cutting issues illuminated by the SDLO, regional platforms to engage host and home regions on issues of sustained development and security of supply, reconciled through commitments such as the African mining vision. National level, voluntary definition of paths to the SDLO. We also recommend that we should build on selected initiatives, such as the 94 Equatorial Principles Financial Institutions, or the EPFIs, to build and harmonize a global standard of good practice anchored on the SDLO. Perhaps also a consideration on creating an extractive chapter on the Global Pact for the Environment. We also believe the country mining visions can be a platform to determine paths for the SDLO through continued dialogue and advocacy on cross-cutting issues. So overall, we are very pleased that the IRP report on mineral resources governance in the 21st century informed Member States' decision at the fourth session of the UN Environment Assembly, UNEA4, to adopt a resolution on mineral resources governance. We look forward to the deliberations of UNEA5.
Thank you very much, Antonio Pedro and Elias Ayuk, for that presentation. We've now been able to listen to 3 presentations. The first one from Pascal Peduzzi from GREED Geneva on sand and sustainability. A second presentation from Elaine Baker from GREED Arundel on mine tailings. And a third presentation from the International Resource Panel from Antonio Pedro and Elias Ayuk. Pedro and Elias and the International Resource Panel, IRP, raise an issue about the plethora of governance frameworks that exist out there and the need to have a whole of society, multi-governance and sustainable development approach in terms of strengthening our governance approaches in the mineral sector. So it is now our time for us to open the floor for any remarks, questions on the initial presentations that have so far been made. Please feel free to post your questions on the chat box, but the floor is now open for any contributions from the member states or other distinguished participants. Use the hand raised icon just to raise your hand, or just type your name on the chat box and we will be able to see it and invite you to make your contribution. I do see a first question here. Elaine Baker from Dennis Mwendwa. Elaine Baker mentioned about tailing dams and the impacts they have to the environment. And the questioner is asking, I would like her to also highlight to us on the environmental effects caused by the increasing number of artisanal miners, small-scale miners, especially in Africa, where this type of mining is ever increasing. We will have responses. Elaine is not with us, but we do have other competent colleagues with us who will be able to take on questions as they arise. Responses will be provided by Robert Wabunoha, Patrick Mwesije, or Angela Karaoke, and the more technical questions will be handled by Professor Daniel Frank. So if any of my colleagues would like to respond to this as we wait for other questions to come through, I'd like to request one of our colleagues to respond to this. The question once again, it's about mine tails. We can highlight the environmental effects caused by the increasing number of artisanal miners, that's the small-scale miners, especially in Africa, where this type of mining is ever increasing. Is Professor Daniel Franks around and able to respond to this question, please? Patrick Mwesije, if you're on the call, and you can be able to provide a few remarks on this question, would be appreciated.
Well, thank you, Cecilia.
Go ahead, Patrick, we can hear you.
You can hear?
Yes,
I'm still, yes. Okay, good morning, Cecilia. Good morning, participants. This question is very crucial for Africa. There might be some tailings dams around, but I think the issue of artisanal miners is increasing all the way through the different countries. And for their livelihood, different miners go in with no safety gear, with no consideration for the environment, and then the impacts cumulatively become much more, not the extent if a large tailings dam collapses, but when you add them up together throughout Africa, the environmental impact is really very devastating. As the participant has mentioned, we need to pay much attention on how these small miners impact on the environment. And one way would be how we can, some countries have other associations already for these small scale miners, but there might not be operational guidelines on how these miners should be working. So one of the issues would be countries to put in place a system on how they can either be licensed, organized in groups, and then they are given standard operating procedures on how their impacts can be mitigated. It might be very difficult to have environmental assessments, but if there are environmental briefs put together on how these different groups of people will be affecting the mining areas. Some training also, capacity building of these small miners, on how to handle effectively the mining of these small artisanal mines would also help in mitigating against the environmental impacts. But the question is very valid, and we need, at the end of this meeting, to have a particular recommendation on how these small miners can be organized and also be aware that their impacts are affecting the environment so that we have a system on how we can forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick Mwesige, for that response. I would now like to invite Professor. I'd like to request participants to mute. Kindly mute as you come in. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Patrick. I would now like to invite Professor Daniel Franks to respond to the second question. Just give me 1 second. The question I'd like you to respond to, Professor, is with regards to data. Is there any data on the extent to which the new guidelines on the construction and maintenance of tailing dams have been adopted? This is a question from May Hermanus. Is there any data on the extent to which the new guidelines on the construction and maintenance of tailing dams have been adopted? Over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Cecilia. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. So there's been quite a lot of reform on the issue of tailings in the past 18 months. There's also a lot of new data about how the mining industry has been operating with regards to tailings. So the Church of England and the Swedish Council on Ethics, they undertook a very large survey, the largest survey in the world on tailings facilities. What the survey showed was that the upstream tailings method that has been associated with a large number of stability issues and tailings dam failures is still a very common type of facility, but it has been in decline in terms of the number of new facilities built with that method. In its place, downstream facilities, which are notably a little bit safer, and facilities that are in pit facilities have been increasing. What we haven't seen is a major change to the dry stack type of facilities, which are significantly more safe from a geotechnical perspective. The Church of England and the Swedish Council of Ethics have also partnered with UNEP and the International Council on Mining and Metals to adopt a new global tailing standard. That tailing standard has been agreed, but it has not yet been publicly announced. It should be announced in the coming weeks. The International Council on Mining Metals has committed that all of its member companies would sign up to that new standard, and there will most likely be an independent organization that would make sure that sites and companies are certified to the standard. So the answer to your question is we've got a lot of data. There is some improvement in tailings facility management, but still a long way to go. And the new standard is yet to be implemented. Thank you, Cecilia.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Professor. I'd like to combine a couple of questions in the interest of time, and I'd kindly request Antonio to be ready from the IRP to respond to a couple of them. I'll combine the SDLO questions and the mineral resource governance questions for you. Will the introduction of the SDLO mean the cessation of existence of the different governance mechanisms as individual items of resource governance? And will the SDLO have room for revision or updating? The second question around SDLO is that I like the idea of SDLO. I think formalization of the social license to operate is critical. How do we balance the need for global standardization with allowing for regional nuance? Usually global standards are harder to adopt when they don't account for different contexts. If you could, Antonio, respond to those two to start with. Please go ahead, Antonio.
Can you hear me? Yes. Good morning, and thank you for
inviting the IRP to participate in this very important conversation. So the first thing that I would like to say is that the SPA law is a dynamic instrument in the sense that it's a living process, and we look for improvement. So indeed, there's room for improvement. We are not naive about its becoming overnight the framework that will unify all of the existing governance instruments. There is, of course, instrument fatigue or initiative fatigue, which provides, therefore, an opportunity for greater consolidation. And that's why in the report, we're suggesting that the principles of the major initiatives, the ITIs of this world, the equitable principles and so on, they should lead to try and first identify what are the common aspects that exist between these existing instruments with a view to consolidating. So it has to be an organic process. But more importantly, and I think there is a question about it, is the idea of the establishment of international rules agency. We believe that notwithstanding all of the concerns about the state of multilateralism and so on and so forth, that by looking at other examples, like for example, the International Energy Agency, there could be a step-by-step process towards establishing that international minerals agency. It's very, very, very important that we have a global governance platform to enable discussions, very critical discussions on the state of governance in the sector. For example, now, as you know, there's this conversation about just transitions, stranded assets. Many of the resource-rich countries depend on fossil fuels to achieve sustained development. Yet, this is in a direct contradiction with the objective of decarbonizing our production systems. How to reconcile all of those apparently conflicting interests is a matter of global interest that requires such agencies. So therefore, we are strongly arguing that UNEA4 should look at the possibility of starting a conversation on the establishment of the International Minerals Agency. So I think I've covered some of the questions here, but the most important thing to say here is that the SPLO is a dynamic instrument that we believe that through a step-by-step process, both at the national, at global, at the continental level, many of, for example, in Africa already, groups like the Southern Africa Development Community, SADC, are incorporating elements that talk to the principles that are enshrined in the SDLO. We have initiatives like Shared Value Initiative that also talk about same principles. So it is about creating a movement that, of course, will take time and patience to arrive at the final destination. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Pascal. There's one question with regards to the applicability, whether the Equator principles on the presentation on mineral resource governance can be used in financing of small-scale mines. Are you able to quickly respond to that one, please?
The Equator principles are a group of large financial institutions that have come together with a view to articulating a set of criteria to finance extractive industry projects. And so they are essentially for large-scale mining. And there is already an effort to try and revisit the Equator principles to adapt them to the ongoing dynamics, including the adoption of SDLO, but it's not directed at artisanal small-scale mining. On the artisanal small-scale mining, there is a body of work that has recognized, this is a quick reaction to some of the comments that I made earlier, that recognize that artisanal small-scale mining is both a poverty-driven activity, but also a poverty alleviation activity. And that is a very important aspect in discussing artisanal small-scale mining. And Daniel Franks will talk about development minerals and all the body of work that recognize that particular component. And there's a publication that is going to be sort of available soon that also has mapped the contribution of business small-scale mining to sustainable development goals. In many jurisdictions, ASM represents a poverty alleviation activity with significant multiplier effects in terms of generating, improving livelihoods, and so on and so forth. So that is important when we discuss the business small-scale mining, that we contextualize it from the perspective of its negative impacts, but also the positive impacts. And the conversation is how to create necessary incentives and instruments with a view to ensure that the benefits are much more than the negative impacts. So this is work in progress. Governments are already have moved from the days when artisanal small-scale mining was considered an illegal activity that would send troops and soldiers and so on and so forth to combat it, to one that is an increasing recognition that is an activity which, when regulated, can contribute to sustained development and poverty alleviation, especially in rural areas. Let me stop here, because otherwise we will have an entire day focused on artisanal small-scale. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I do recognize there are quite a number of other questions, comments that have arisen and are well presented in the chat box. I'd like to encourage you to continue to use the chat box for questions, and I also encourage our resource persons to also take the opportunity to respond to some of them or all of them on the chat box as we proceed. We will come back to the question and answer session where we'll take up a few more of those questions, but kindly allow me, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, for us to move to the next session in the interest of time. Before we move to the next session of this consultation, please allow me to kindly remind us of some important meeting guidance. And I do request our colleagues to post some of this guidance on the screen if possible. Please remember to keep your microphones muted during the presentations, as this reduces the interferences and facilitates our cordial communication. The question and answer question will follow after the next presentation. And if you would like to pose a question, please share it at any time via the chat function on the WebEx control panel, and we will read your questions during the Q&A after the presentation, time allowing. And I'm also encouraging the resource persons to provide some responses on the chat box as we proceed. Again, I want to remind you that this session is being recorded and will be available on our web page. All participants are invited to access the web page for the recording and further information after this session. The presentations and the materials, including the videos for today's briefing and subsequent consultations, will also be available on the web page. Now we move to the next session, and it is indeed my pleasure to invite Professor Daniel Franks to take us through the substantive content of the resolution and the roadmap to UNEA4. Professor Franks, the floor is yours.
At the University of Queensland. I'm supporting the United Nations Environment Programme on the implementation of the United Nations Environment Assembly Resolution on Mineral Resource Governance. In this short presentation, I'll provide some background to the Mineral Resource Governance Resolution and overview the consultations that we're conducting in the lead up to UNEA4 in 2021. At the fourth session of the United Nations Environment Assembly, held in Nairobi, Kenya, from the 11th to the 15th of March in 2019, the Assembly adopted a resolution on mineral resource governance. The resolution was sponsored by Mexico and co-sponsored by Switzerland. The operative text of the resolution requests that UNEP collect information on sustainable practices, identify knowledge gaps and options for implementation strategies, and undertake an overview of existing assessments of different governance initiatives and approaches relating to the sustainable management of metal and mineral resources. Further, this information should be reported to the United Nations Environment Assembly at its fifth session. The resolution reflects the growing prominence of mineral resource governance as a topic of international cooperation and builds on a number of foundational studies conducted by UNEP. The first is the International Resource Panel report, Mineral Resource Governance in the 21st Century, Gearing Extractive Industries Towards Sustainable Development. This report was released as a summary for policymakers in 2019, with a full report published in 2020. The second is the 2019 UNEP Grid Geneva report, Sand and Sustainability, Finding New Solutions for Environmental Governance of Global Sand Resources. The final group of reports are the 2017 R&R report, Mine Tailing Storage, Safety is No Accident, and the follow-up 2018 report, A Roadmap for Improved Mine Waste Management. UNEP's work on tailings recently culminated in the adoption of the Global Industry Tailings Management Standard, which itself was the result of a global tailings review co-convened by UNEP, the Principles on Responsible Investment, and the International Council on Mining and Metals. In support of the resolution, we have prepared a discussion paper that summarises global trends in minerals and sustainable development. It presents key findings from the aforementioned foundational studies and presents a range of options for the governance of minerals and lessons from best practices. Questions are posed for consideration during the consultations and for future action on the topic. Consultative meetings on the resolution are being held from July through September of 2020. These virtual consultations will be held in all parts of the globe with more than 20 meetings in total. The formats include briefings for member state governments, as well as sub-regional, regional, and global multi-stakeholder consultations. The consultations aim to obtain feedback on the governance of the extractive industries, understand the political landscape as well as regional needs. More specifically, and requested by the UNEA4 resolution, the consultations will also help identify best practices and knowledge gaps, assess governance options, and consider common elements of interest for next steps. We are inviting written submissions on the consultation questions outlined in the discussion paper. A survey link is available to submit feedback, or please send submissions to our email address. We are encouraging the public to submit short videos. We have developed a podcast series, the Mineral Governance Podcast, where I speak with special guests about the big issues facing minerals and sustainability. Findings from the regional consultations will feed into the report on the implementation on the resolution, which will be presented to the UNEA at its 5th session in February 2021. While the discussion paper outlines a wide range of questions that we are interested in hearing your views on, the key consultation questions that will guide the consultation meetings are: what are the most pressing mineral resource governance challenges in your region, and what initiatives and approaches would help to address these challenges? What good or best practice examples can inspire sustainable or responsible development, extraction, use and management of minerals? Specifically, are there any related to mine tailings and sand extraction? And based on the mineral resource governance challenges and gaps in your region, what themes and issues should be the focus of future action, including by international or UN bodies on mineral resource governance? I'd like to encourage you to make your voice heard as part of this process by making a submission. We have a dedicated webpage on the Green Growth Knowledge platform where you can find out more and get involved. And finally, thanks for your time. We look forward to learning more as we move through this process.
Okay, thank you very much. I continue to kindly request participants to mute to allow us to have some good conversation. Thank you very much, Professor, for that introduction, particularly on process. And I would like to open the floor for more questions. Again, encourage you as much as possible to post those questions on the chat box so as to enable us have a good record of the questions, but also be able to get our resource persons to respond to you. So we would like to invite you to raise any questions you may have from Professor Frank's presentation on process.
zote tunafaa kupewa nini? Provisional ama ni
Okay. If not, then I'll pick a couple of questions from the chat box to keep us going. I'll take the question from Nelly Mutemeri, who asks, that's basically a question and a comment, and she says she has a comment on the question of tailings from ASM. I think there are two perspectives important to consider. The first is that ASM produces own waste, and secondly, there are common occurrences or informal ASM illegally encroaching on existing tailings storage facilities for large miners. The challenges require different approaches in seeking solutions. The first one can be approached and enabling to good practices, while the second, it's about engaging different stakeholders with government at the center as enforcers of regulation negatively affected by these activities. That's more of a comment. I'd like to get a question. Let me go down. Yeah, a lot of comments, and I think we really appreciate your comments also. I see a lot of comments, not really questions. Jere Baru says, in commenting on the question, what are the most pressing mineral resource governance challenges in your jurisdiction or region? And we will go to those questions later. This session was mainly to open for a Q&A specific to the presentation made by Professor Frank now. Do we have any questions from the floor? If you have any question, Excellencies, we will be able to unmute you to ask any questions you may have this far. Please use the hand raise. I am at the moment just perusing to see if there is anybody who has raised their hand. Okay, so it means the presentation by Professor Frank was clear, and therefore we can now go to the next session, which is the plenary discussion. And in this session, we will be answering the 3 questions that were on the last slide of Professor Frank's presentation, and I'd like to request the Secretariat to post those 3 questions again on the screen. So the 3 questions that will guide our conversation this afternoon are: what are the most pressing mineral resource governance challenges in your jurisdiction or region? What are the governance initiatives and approaches which help address these challenges? The second question, what good or best practice examples can inspire sustainable or responsible development in the extraction, use, and management of mineral resources? Are there any related to mine tailings facilities and sand extraction? And third, based on the mineral resource governance challenges and gaps in our region, what themes and issues should be the focus of future action, including by international or UN bodies on mineral governances? At this stage, allow me to open the floor to distinguished representatives from Malawi who will be able to make an intervention at this stage. I'd like to request that you keep your intervention to a few minutes so that we can take additional comments from participants. Welcome, distinguished representative of Malawi, to make your initial contribution.
Thank you very much. Some of the most pressing mineral resource governance challenges in our country involve the regulation and formalization of artisanal and small-scale miners. And with regard to this challenge, what we have experienced is a proliferation of a lot of illegal activities, and government is usually late to respond to this challenge because these activities take place in areas that are very difficult to access. And like on this point of artisanal and small scale mining, what we have also experienced as a country is the issue of sand mining. Sand mining is largely unregulated in Malawi. So it is mostly done by informal miners, and they are usually small groups of individuals. So to respond to some of these challenges, what the government has done is, first of all, going through the route of formalization by cooperatives. And also, we have recently revised our Mines and Minerals Act. So under this act, we have introduced artisanal mining permits. These ones are under the jurisdiction of local governments. But we have a problem with local governments in that, but like under the Mines and Minerals Act, we require them to formulate bylaws to govern these artisanal and small-scale mining activities in their jurisdictions. But so far, I think there's a lack of awareness among the regional, like local governments, on the formulation of these bylaws. So far, we have observed that there are no bylaws that have been formulated to govern these extraction activities. And another major challenge in our country is probably there has been a lack of effective regulation of mine closure. Now, under the new act, we have included a number of provisions to govern this problem, and we require medium and large scale mining license applicants to submit their detailed mine closure plans as they are applying for their mining licenses. Now we have just started implementing the new act, and the effectiveness of this measure is yet to be seen, but we are hopeful that with this new change in the law, we will have some positive outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, distinguished representative of Malawi. The floor is still open for others that may want to make a contribution. We invite our member state representative, and we are requesting as much as possible, let's focus on providing answers to the questions that have been raised, as this will be quite good guidance for us in developing and preparing our resolutions for this meeting. So the floor is open to other member states that may want to make some interventions at this time. As we wait for other member states to come in, I'd like to invite a representative from the Mineral Law Institute at the University of Cape Town to make their intervention also at this stage. Representative from the Mineral Law Institute, University of Cape Town. You have the floor.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you can. Go ahead, please.
Yes, this is Bernard Kenny. I guess by Mineral Law Institute in South Africa, we actually mineral law in Africa. I guess that's what we're referring to, and that I'm not stepping into someone else's shoes. And if that is correct, so my name is Bernard Kenny, and I'm representing here Mineral Law in Africa of UCT, and we looking at the question, what we observe, which looking at the things we've conducted research on, our findings tend to show us that in Africa, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where most of our research is focused, we realize that when it comes to governance in the sector of mineral resources, one major issue is it usually starts with the law. And I will move down the ladder to show how the law affects downstream. And it usually starts with the law, whereby often law and policy making in their design, in some cases, are not explicit enough. And that already starts where the problem starts. And even where we have laws that are really well written and very explicit on what should be done, what is good practice and what is not good practice, you still find that another issue which often come up, and I'm glad that I think Elaine raised that, implementation is one major issue. Implementation usually comes up as a hindrance or these laws to be properly implemented. And then you also have enforcement issues and compliance from the mining sector itself. And what we observe, why would this implementation or enforcement or even compliance be an issue, is that often government desire to pursue economic development is one of the issues. That's just one of it. On the other hand, we have issues of accountability and lack of transparency. I mean, things that hinder law to be implemented as it should and does, affecting governance of these resources. So you also have public participation, whereby not enough is done to make sure that all stakeholders actually have a say and have a check on what is going on. And one thing we find is that usually there's lack of capacity. So the lack of implementation is not always because government doesn't want to. There's also lack of capacity, and that is associated with having people that even lack the capacity to do the work they should be doing. It's not just that the government lacks staff or they lack people to do the work. Sometimes people are there and still don't even understand what they should be doing or how these laws should be implemented. And then there's your political will, which can link back to economic development. Because if you are pursuing, especially in Africa, where we know many economies depend on the extractive sectors for their development. And so sometimes the political will to put some brakes and make sure that the governance initiatives are well implemented can become an issue. And so our research, we really are of the view that for governance to move forward, for the research sector, I mean, for the extractive sector to be well governed, definitely law and policy making has to be up to the point, and that will bring some accountability, transparency, and something we observe, and I noticed that one person raised it here, is capacity building. I do believe that it doesn't matter how much we have good laws in Africa, capacity building will be an issue, something that I hope this resolution will take into account to say, my suggestion is that as you encourage member states to have good laws, to make sure that these laws are well implemented and to pursue practice, it will be necessary to consider how to build capacity to make sure that the people who will be implementing these laws or who will pursue good governance in the extractive sector will actually understand what they're supposed to do and do it the right way. That's what I can say for now. I'm not sure if my colleague Kennedy Chege has something to add.
Yes, thank you very much, Bernard, Cecilia, and the delegates that are in attendance. It's not really to add to what you've mentioned. So firstly, I'm Kennedy Chege. I'm also a representative for mineral law in Africa, in South Africa, but I'm originally from Kenya. So just to emphasize what Dr. Bernard Kingney has explained, the major problem that we identified is with regards to the legal framework, where, for example, in South Africa, it's not really clear in terms of the ownership of mineral resources between private parties and the state. Instead, the principal legislation, which is the Mineral Law Policy, Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, it gives it talks of a custodianship model. It doesn't vest ownership in private parties or the state. However, it's not really clear what custodianship means, and there's been a lot of scholarship in that regard as people try and conceptualize or create theories as to what that would mean. Also, the second thing is that as we develop the legal framework, we would like to propose that they promote a balance and also to recognize the interests of the different stakeholders. Because normally in many countries in Africa, we've seen non-state actors are normally not really involved much in the policy in terms of mineral ownership and how the rights are granted. And then also lastly, we would also need to talk about the lack of transparency. That is also a major issue in terms of our laws, not in South Africa, but generally in the whole of Africa. But we also identified some initiatives that can be used to address these challenges. Firstly, we've seen from a the African Union has taken steps to promote good governance, best practices in Africa. And this is aimed at addressing the weak governance record that had been seen through the various legal instruments. For example, we have the AU Constitutive Act, which promotes the values of accountability and transparency, which are the main principles of good governance. Also, we have seen the African Mining Vision, which is also meant to promote these principles of good governance. Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, colleagues from UCT. We really appreciate your contribution. I'd now like to invite Dennis Mwendwa to take the floor. Dennis Mwendwa, please go ahead.
Thank you, Cecilia. The two gentlemen that have just spoke have highlighted the importance of the mineral law, actually, which is very good. But my understanding is that knowing the resource base is critical before proceeding to having the mineral law. Because you may have a law, but without knowing your resources and where they are actually and how much resources you have, the whole process of extraction will not be informed. So in my opinion, African governments need to invest a lot in their resource base before embarking on extraction. I'm of the view that UNEP and the other regional international organizations should invest a lot or should invest more in helping African government account for their natural resources, know their copper, as opposed to just having a law and then going into mining. An example would be a country would decide to go and do mining in a forest reserve or a game reserve, and then they turn out to find out the minerals that are there are less in value as compared to those or to those game reserves over a long period of time. So my opinion or my suggestion would be that we need to invest a lot in knowing our resource base before jumping into forming laws. So when we are forming laws, we are informed that these laws are going to govern these minerals, and if you are to invest in this particular area, then we invest on an informed basis that the investment that we are making in this particular area of minerals is better than what is actually there, as opposed to just go and mine, and after 2, 3, 4, 5 years, you do a mine closure, and then the environmental impact is much bigger. Thus is, in my opinion, that UNEP and the other multilateral organizations should be investing a lot or helping many governments in Africa to actually know their resource base or do the natural resource accounting before they into mining. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dennis, for that very useful, valuable contribution. I would now like to invite Tumai Murombo from Wits University to make your contribution and expound more on the comment you've made on the chat. So I would like to invite you if you'd like to make your comments and suggestions just unmute yourself and make your contribution. Welcome, Tumai.
Thank you, Cecilia, and to colleagues listening. My point that I was trying to make is that a lot of the laws, mining laws that we have in Africa, still
still persisting with the ideologies. They are still persisting with the framework which is aimed at enabling multinational mining corporations, large-scale mining corporations, to be involved in the mining sector or in other extractive sectors. I think this is where we have a serious challenge with artisanal and small-scale miners being framed as illegal actors. But for example, in Zimbabwe, over the past 3 years, artisanal and small-scale gold miners were the biggest contributors to the gold exported by the country. At one point, they are treated as illegal. On another point, they are applauded for contributing to the fiscus. So I think that our mining codes, mostly across most of Southern Africa, and in fact the whole of Africa, still retain the focus on large-scale mining and criminalizing artisanal small-scale mining, which is mostly a preserve of indigenous communities, local communities who want to break into this enclave economy. And I think our deliberations should be focusing on ensuring that we make recommendations to states to create legal frameworks that are decolonized and enable small-scale players to enter into the mining and other extractive sectors with appropriate frameworks that enable them to financially, economically, and environmentally comply with the laws. I'm talking of the serious artisanal and small-scale miners and not illegal miners who should face the full wrath of the law in terms of the criminality of the activities. So we need to distinguish within artisanal and small-scale miners those who are actually properly constituted and who are interested in getting involved in the mining business, and illegal activities for which I think the normal criminal laws should still be applicable. But I think most of our mining codes should be decolonized by enabling entry to small-scale miners and resourcing them, building the capacity. Thank you.
And the challenge was that to excellent condition. I would absolutely
kindly mute. Someone is interrupting.
No, you should do just like. Oh.
Okay, can we check who's? Yeah. Please still have an interruption.
My boss. Hello, hello.
Okay, Tumai, please continue.
Thank you so much. I was almost concluding before the interruption. Therefore, in sum, I was saying that we need to focus on enabling, providing a framework for countries to decolonize their mining codes to enable entry into the mining sector and other extractive industries by small-scale players. And we should really stop continuing focusing on these frameworks that are costly to comply with, costly to enforce, and that can only be easily complied with by large-scale miners, who in fact are themselves also not still complying fully. But I strongly feel that we need to create an enabling environment for artisanal and small-scale miners that could also address the poverty and other issues that drive several of our communities into illegal mining. But illegalizing small-scale activities is not a solution. Decolonizing existing mining codes that we inherited from the colonial powers is very important by creating frameworks that can be complied with, less costly, but still retaining the environmental standards that we aspire to. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very valuable contribution. I will be calling on a couple of people. I just want to alert you so that you are aware and so that you can prepare yourself, mainly based on some of the comments you've made on the chat, but also those that had their hands up before. So I'll start with Claude Kabembe of the South Africa Resource Watch, and I hope you can also address some of the questions related to human rights. Then I will call on Laban Owor, be ready after Claude Kabembe, and then a distinguished delegate whose address on the WebEx is Amor78. So Amor78, if you could come third, and then fourth, I'll call on Hudson Ntega. So if we could start with Claude Kabembe. Claude Kabembe, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. I just want to make a point that first that what we've seen is that there are now very progressive legislation in our countries, which have adopted quite international standards and norms. But I think what we need to check is also I think the biggest problem we have is the lack of capacity, the weakness of the state to really deal with the management of our mineral resources. And when you go across our continent, mining administrations are not ready really to manage this sector. And I think there might be need really to invest in management capacity of the sector. The second element is the politicization of the sector. There's very much conflict of interests where we see political leaders, especially ruling parties, very much involved in controlling this sector because it's the provision of much of the resources that are used in political control, and the relationship between politics and these multinational companies is very problematic. So it will also open up opportunities for corruption. There is a lot of corruption in this sector that we need to see how we mitigate it. On the human rights side, I think what we've seen is both, especially in the industrial sector, is the lack of grievances mechanisms for local communities to take up their issues around exclusion, around pollution. And you know that you take the case of SADC, you take the case of Zambia, the Kafue River is one of the most polluted river in the world. Most of our tailing dams are closer to these communities. You take in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Glencore has been producing cobalt, but this cobalt has been produced in an area where there is uranium. We don't know where that uranium goes. And suddenly we are seeing people, kids, babies being born deformed. But communities have got no ways of raising these issues. So we need to reinforce grievances mechanism for communities' capacity to really engage with government and to engage with mining companies. There is an issue of free and prior informed consent that needs to be reinforced because we've seen exclusion of a big group of people who are affected by this extraction, both at the artisanal mining and both at the industrial mining. And this free and prior informed consent need to be continuous from the beginning of mining, during the mining and post-mining. But to end, for sake of time, I think we've seen the critical principles such as the polluter pays, which has never been enforced by our government, and that is having serious impact on our environment. And as minerals get depleted, we are seeing these companies going further and further in very protected areas. We need to balance between mining and the protection of environment. Up to now, what we've seen is that is not taken into care. The race to the bottom and the attraction of foreign direct investment is pushing our government to totally ignore the ecological consequences of this extractive industry. So we need to elevate. And with COVID-19, just to end, we might see really these mining companies asking for relief, which might be relief in terms of taxes, which might be relief in terms of social and corporate social responsibilities, and even their social and environmental responsibilities to deal with the impact on their finances. And we need to look into those things. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kabembe, for your contribution. At this stage, allow me to invite His Excellency representative from Zimbabwe before going back to my list to make their intervention. The distinguished representative of Zimbabwe, if you could take the floor now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you also for convening this meeting during this new normal. Just for the sake of time, I only wished to speak about something that is very, very dear to my government that we just wanted some clarification on. And that is to support the very important points which were made by one of the previous speakers concerning the need to know the extent of the resource base. In this regard, I would like to ask if UNEP has the capacity to assist member states with remote sensing, even if it means that they will be roping in countries who have the necessary technology for that. In Africa, usually it is the artisanal miners who discover deposits, and then governments come in to explore the claim. And that is why my question on the chart was about international laws that are designed to protect developing nations against exploitation by multinational outfits who are only there for profit making without caring about the welfare of the people and as well as the environment. So if a country were to know exactly what was where, then they can also regulate even the small scale miners and the artisanal miners on how they operate. This is the question that I wanted to find out from UNEP, if UNEP has this capacity to help member states in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, distinguished representative from Zimbabwe. And I believe the UNEP Secretariat has taken note of your question and will come back to respond. I just want to see if there is any other member state who would like to give you priority at this stage before I call on other distinguished colleagues. If there is a member state, just unmute yourself and please make your intervention now. Okay, I do not see any member state or hear a member state making the intervention, but please do feel free to come in at any time. I'd now like to invite Laban Owor to make your contribution. Laban Owor.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, clearly. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to basically talk about the challenges that possibly we face in my resource governance in my country. And possibly this may talk about the review of the mining law that the ministry or the government has been talking about, that they are reviewing. Now it is taken over 3 years for us in the mining sector. We're ready to receive this, but we are not actually having it. They keep saying they are reviewing, sort of bureaucracy in the administration. Then one of the speakers also talks about politicizing the sector, and that is so common, whereby somehow you find a company or a legal license holder being oppressed, not being allowed full rights to operate. For example, the recent ban on the mineral export in Uganda, where there is no clear definition as to what percentage of concentrates you want the companies to reach so that they can export. There is surely no base for companies, legal operating companies, to bet. The government wants us to concentrate, to add value to this percentage so that we can have our exports untampered with. Then possibly also you find a scenario where you have your license, you have the right, you have the right to mine the process, But then you can't really do that. You can just wake up one day in the morning, you find your whole side, you find that is an offense being guided by the military, telling people this place is out of bounds without any reason. As you push for it to know the reason, they begin to threaten your life, beginning to threaten your operations. We can close you. And it's one of the, we're actually facing a challenge where you find that state minister for main road development is trying to address issues, but you find her life being threatened by people who are guided by the state, people who have ammunitions, people, the military. So possibly me politicizing and the involvement of the state that is so much enabled with military is interfering with the governance of the resources in Uganda.
Oh, thank you. Okay, go ahead.
And I beg to end there.
Okay, no, thank you very much for your contribution, as well appreciated. I'd like to invite Amwa78, and if you could just mention your name and affiliation, that will be really useful.
Hello?
Hello, please go ahead and say your name and affiliation, please. Thank you.
My name is Afma Kilembe. I'm an engineer from the Ministry of Minerals of Tanzania. Okay, my contribution is wrote previous in the page that adding a number of small-scale miners with that it has some economic benefit, it creates some employment and stuff of a kind, but on the other hand, it's too expensive to the environment as it adds a footprint, and very unfortunate that footprint is coming from people who are not capable of restoring it. So my concern on this, regulators and the government should sit down and see what extent they can assist the miners, at least to make sure they have any effort to assist them on restoration of the environment. That's my contribution.
Okay. No, thank you very much. Thank you very much. The next person to speak, I'd like to invite Mr. Hudson Mutega. Hudson Mutega.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you very much. My name is Hudson, and I'm affiliated with the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. Observations. Number one, I did put forward initially the problem of capacity. And to begin with, I do appreciate and acknowledge and give credence to all this great work that UNEP has done and the various recommendations that they're putting through to member states, particularly in the case of Africa. What I raised earlier was, with all these recommendations which governments are supposed to consider, the major concern is capacity. I think this has been raised by my colleague earlier on. The second issue that I want to raise is the acknowledgement that the extractive sector, particularly the mining sector, 65% of expenses paid by mining companies go to services and capital goods supply. And I think that is so critical for sustainable development for governance of the mineral sector. Because if countries maximize the 65% in terms of services and capital goods at whatever level, the higher the better, several other issues get sorted out in terms of illicit transfers. So instead of externalizing illicit transfers, you actually reduce the possibilities of illicit transfer activities. And that's just one of those. The next one in terms of local content is the participation of our local universities in what's going on in terms of tailings design, in terms of environmental issues. And in this way, we'll be able to internalize the knowledge, the IP, the information that may be transferred to governments rather than relying on external companies that we invite specifically for them to come and make a profit. Now, these are issues that dwell on capabilities and capacities in terms of research and development and the normal skills. Otherwise, all these recommendations will be put on shelves and gather dust all the time. The other small issue I wanted to raise was in terms of the private sector. They're doing a good job. Most of the companies, most of the countries are benefiting a lot from mineral resources. But we do see that there is a lot of, all companies want to survive. And this is a cutthroat industry. In other words, all companies want to get the best. And the chief executives will have a contract of 5 years to turn around their companies. So in other words, most of the CEOs, forgive me for CEOs on this panel, but then they turn around the companies within the 5 years to make sure that, is it 3 years or 5 years, to make sure that they deliver. In other words, their first priority is to the stakeholder. The stakeholder, in other words, the investor, the owner of the money. The last one on the agenda is what we as countries is the long-term cause, in other words, human well-being. Those become the last on the agenda. We have a program where we want to develop a long-term agenda, sustainable development over the long term. The CEOs have an agenda for 3 years, and hence for the long term, they have, that tends to be downplayed. So who then becomes the most important? I do appreciate that the EITI, where now it is requesting for the owners of the companies, and would really appreciate that the owners of the companies get more involved with the government so that we are able to develop long-term plans for human development within the countries of Africa. That becomes a critical agenda for development. Thank you very much. I'll leave it at there.
Thank you very much, Hudson, for your contribution. I will take one more contribution before we go to our final session on the key points. And I'd like to invite Lupi Sally Roman. Lupi Sally Roman, if you can unmute yourself and make your contribution. It's your moment now. Welcome.
Hello? Hello?
Please go ahead.
Yes, this is Lupi Sally Roman from South Sudan, Minister of Mining. Regarding the guiding questions, in South Sudan, we have principal issues regarding the mining code we have. And if we adopted the mine cadastre system, which is part of the EITI, but it's after 5 years of the system, we start to realize there is some shortcoming to the system. It's not transparent enough, and there is this issue of access to information regarding mining activities and exploration activity in South Sudan. The second issue is social conflicts. Raised recently 3 years ago when we start promoting the small scale mining in the country. The social conflict started. There was a small mining companies and the communities regarding the community development agreement. There's no clear boundaries what the responsibilities and liability from each partners. And we have issues with environmental issues regarding small scale activities and artisanal miners as well, and safety and health issues. And when it comes to the Ministry of Mining, we have critical issues based on the capacity building. There is not much experts or well-trained engineer within the Ministry of Mining. The government is trying to address the issues, but it's too much to handle at the moment. Regarding best practice examples, people talking about, but for me personally, I think there is moment of corporate good governance as corporate to adopt the best practices. And that's all. And team to adopt it for me is transparency is the first thing, and health, safety, and environment is the theme that's supposed to be focused on in the regions and also in my country. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, distinguished representative of South Sudan. I'd like to invite Lassina Pakun. Lassina, if you are on, if you can take a minute or two just to make your contribution.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chair. I hope you can hear me there because we are having some internet challenge here. So
yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to quickly go through the 3 guiding questions and trying to take it to a different perspective, and because I wanted to specifically talk about development minerals and how we've been trying to, along with the African mining vision, we've been trying to improve the performance of the sector, given it was mainly it is still mainly artisanal and informal. So my name is Lassina, and I'm affiliated with the UNDP Regional Service Center for Africa. So talking about development minerals quickly, please note that development minerals are minerals that are mined, processed, and used close to the areas and the communities where they are actually being mined. So look no further. We are talking about dimension stones, construction materials, industrial minerals, and semi-precious stones. That said, why are they really important for our context here? Because we've been discussing a lot about artisanal and small-scale mining, and most of the discussion was centered around gold mining, which is true. because it's the, I would say, it's the one of the most marketed minerals in the world. So the development minerals, and particularly artisanal and small-scale mining of development minerals, are also important because of the tremendous value addition potential and the job creation opportunities that goes with it in the African context, and also the possibility of really using them to develop high-end good that can really reduce the heavy reliance of African countries on import, because development minerals can be used across a large swath of sectors such as construction, such as agriculture, for fertilizer, such as high-end luxury houses, such as kitchenware, and all over across the board. So now, when we looking at the sector from development perspective, it has been really sidelined from development initiatives. Sidelined because the sector has also been, like someone said before, neglected and I would say completely out of the scope of policy making. That when we look at whatever is being done when it comes to infrastructure, road construction, and urbanization, development minerals are at the forefront. So despite the sector being completely informal and dominated by the lack of formalization. So until now, in terms of challenge, the sector in most legislation and jurisdiction, the sector is not recognized as such in the mining codes and policy document. But working with governance with government across the years has actually helped UNDP and its partners, including the African Union, to work hand in hand with government to formalize the sector in a number of countries. Formalize the sector in terms of helping artisanal and small-scale miners to come up with a cooperative association and small, micro and medium-scale enterprises to work across the sector and add value to the minerals that I just mentioned. And the good news is, one of the good news is that the development minerals don't really produce tailing and pollute the environment just as other minerals being produced artisanally, because the extraction process doesn't involve the use of chemicals as we know it for other minerals. So in terms of focus, key issues for further action, throughout our interaction with government, with small-scale artisanal miners and other sector stakeholders, we believe that the future future action should be focused on recognizing the value of the development minerals and proceed from there with a strong formalization in the let's say formalization wheels, not only at the political level but also at the at the implementation level, so that whatever is decided at the policy level is also implemented on the ground. Through most artisanal and small-scale mining activities, when it comes to gold and other precious stones, are labeled in certain countries as illegal. But when it comes to development minerals, there's a growing push for an increased push for organizing the sector in order to transform it and also facilitate the access to information when it comes to geological data, because without reliable and widely available geological data, mining will continue, artisanal and small-scale mining will continue to be business as usual, and with a significant footprint on environment. And yes, finally, the sustainability aspect, which is how to involve the the artisanal and small-scale miners themselves into developing their own standards when it comes to environment, community health, and safety, because all these aspects also have to be introduced in the ASM sector, in the ASM operation and practice, and make it a widespread culture that can really take the sector to the next level, because based on the African mining vision principles, AXM should be seen as a gradual activity, as a progressive activity, which should be used as livelihood development, not only livelihood development activities, but also social and economic transformation, social and economic transformation tool from the local to the national level. So yes, the involvement of the miners themselves in designing their own standard that can be applicable and consumable at their own level will be a key lever if we want the ASM sector to really hold to really meet or even beat the challenges that we are currently facing and discussing. So, Mrs. Chair, that was my contribution, and thank you very much for the floor.
No, thank you very much. Excellencies, distinguished representatives, ladies and gentlemen, would really like to thank you very much for the contributions you've made so far. Written submissions, video submissions, and responses to the online survey are welcome, and we will be sending to you the link, and I think the link has now been sent for you to be able to make your contributions to that survey. We have now reached the closing of this consultation, but before we end the consultation, I'm very pleased to invite Professor Daniel Franks to make some closing points at this point. Professor Franks, you're most welcome.
Cecilia, and I won't take long. I know that we're now over time, but I just wanted to really thank you all for a very rich conversation. We will take all of these insights that we've heard today into consideration when developing the final report that goes to UNEA4. We will have regional summaries on the events as well, condensing information. One thing that I really took out of today's discussion strongly was the issue around capacity building at all levels and on a whole range of issues. I would really encourage you, as Cecilia just mentioned, and as Angela has posted in the chat, to make written submissions. We are challenged by the COVID crisis. We're doing virtual forms of consultation. That comes with it some advantages, but also some challenges. We want to hear your voice. We want to include your voice. The more specific suggestions that you have around best practices or things that should be done, the better, because it helps us to push that perspective forward if it's one that gains widespread support. So thank you again, and encourage you to continue to make your voice heard. Thank you, Cecilia.
Thank you very much, Professor Franks. Let me now turn to my colleague, Robert Wabunoha, Regional Coordinator for Environmental Governance, to give us key takeaways from this consultation. Robert, you're welcome. Robert? Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As the Chair has announced, my name is Noha, the UNEA4 Office on Environment Governance. I want to thank all the participants. This is a very rich governance issues of minerals. As Daniel has said, we'll send a report, and it would be dangerous for me to summarize too much on the hours. What I have seen in the whole discussion is there is a very strong voice which came out on bringing small scale and artisanal miners from outside the regulatory sector. They need to become formal and stop being informal without the traditional big mining sector, and also bringing in the development minerals into the whole discussion governance. I've also noticed that there are so many recommendations which were made at national, regional, and a few issues which came in chat box which were global nature. There was a very issue on strengthening the law and for minerals in Africa, and that has a lot of issues: implementation, enforcement, compliance, public participation, political will, transparency, bringing in the African Free Trade Area Agreement, also issues related to transforming the whole sector to development of the other big issue which came out was the need to invest in the resource base. We need to know the resource we have, using scientific means or whichever means, so that we're able to know, account for the resource, and also put value into the resource. And that ties down to the issues of capacity and management issues. So many came out, issues of assessment, also knowing the thresholds which we need to do, value addition, and also, and first things, knowing the value chain. Research and development came out very strong on knowing the environmental issues, the IPs, design, and so on, skills development, social economic conflicts, how to resolve those, training, and so on, and so on. There was also a strong, I think it came across participants, many participants, the issues of related to political, the issue in Africa, and which continuously need to be improved and solved. Issues of transparency and interference, issues of human rights, addressing human rights and having a mechanism to address, to redress conflicts in the main came out, public participation, then communities need to be capacitated so as for them to engage with companies, governments, and such things, and so on. Prime principle, foreign direct investment, also political issue where governments abroad foreign direct investment, and those companies are not responsible, not have responsible mining in terms of taxes, economic, economic issues, and responsibilities. There was a point which government in the next meeting, the private sector, it came in at the last, and I think throughout, could not hear points coming out of the private sector in terms of issues of transforming them from being short-term investors to become long-term investors are responsible so as to know they can absorb the impacts, the long-term impacts of such development. I thought those were the key points which came out. Also, we'll try as much as possible pick, make them than what I have summarized, but this is what I could capture from participants on such a short. Back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Robert. We had a little bit of choppiness, but indeed we've had an extremely rich discussion and consultation this morning, and we really want to thank you for your contributions. As I said, again, finally, if you have any feedback or questions on any of the aspects presented during this consultation, please feel free to contact us using the contact details that have been displayed, that are going to be displayed on the screen. Excellencies, distinguished representatives, ladies and gentlemen, we very much thank you and look forward to welcoming you to the larger regional consultation, which will be convened on the 6th of August, 2020, and will be held on the Kudo virtual platform, which will also allow for simultaneous interpretation in both English and French. Again, please do not forget to register for the session by sending an email to us, and the web address is posted on www.greengrowthknowledgeplatform.org. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and delegates, thank you very much for your attention, and a very good rest of the day or evening, depending on which part of the world you are dialing in from. Goodbye, and see you on the 6th of August. Have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.